It was June 12, 1944, over the skies of northern France. Hauptmann Werner Hoffman, a veteran of the Luftwaffe with 47 confirmed kills, watched through his gun sight as an American fighter rolled into a diving attack. The aircraft was massive, grotesquely large by Luftwaffe standards. It looked more like a freight locomotive than a pursuit plane, its radial engine cowling bulging like the snout of some industrial beast. Hoffman had been briefed about the P-47 Thunderbolt. He knew it was heavy, nearly 8 tons when fully loaded. He knew it was fast in a dive, capable of exceeding 500 miles per hour. But as the American fighter opened fire at 400 yards, what Hoffman experienced was not speed or weight. It was volume. The air between them transformed into a corridor of tracers so dense it appeared solid, like a tunnel of light carved through the atmosphere. Every fifth round glowed phosphorescent marking rounds designed to help pilots observe their fire, but between each tracer were 4 more bullets, invisible, travelling at 2,840 feet per second. Hoffman's wingman, Lieutenant Karl Brandt, disintegrated, not exploded, not shot down. The Fu W-190's wing folded backward, its fuselage crumpling like paper as over 60 rounds struck within a 2-second burst. The debris cloud that followed contained no recognizable pieces larger than a fuel tank fragment. I thought at first we had encountered multiple aircraft firing simultaneously, Hoffman wrote in his post-mission report. Only later did I understand it was a single fighter. A single pilot. 8 machine guns synchronized to fire as one weapon system. Hoffman. Werner. Luftwaffe Combat Report 4427. June 1944. Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv. When German intelligence officers at Luftflotte 3 headquarters examined gun camera footage from surviving pilots, they initially refused to believe the analysis. The mathematics seemed impossible. One officer calculated that the P-47, if equipped as reported with 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, could theoretically deliver 3,200 rounds per minute, a fire rate exceeding that of many ground-based anti-aircraft batteries. The calculation was verified. Then it was recalculated. Then verified again. Each M2 machine gun had a cyclic rate of 750 to 850 rounds per minute, depending on barrel temperature and ammunition batch. Multiply by 8 guns, and the theoretical maximum approached 6,800 rounds per minute. However, practical combat firing accounting for barrel heating, ammunition feed reliability, and pilot trigger discipline averaged around 400 rounds per minute per gun. That meant 3,200 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition could be delivered downrange every 60 seconds. To contextualize that firepower, a single 2-second burst from a P-47 released approximately 107 rounds. Each 50 caliber bullet weighed 1.7 ounces and carried 13,000 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. In that 2-second window, the P-47 delivered over 11 pounds of metal, travelling at nearly Mach 3, with a combined kinetic energy exceeding 1.3 million foot-pounds. German pilots compared it to flying into a storm of industrial machinery. The P-47D-25, the variant most commonly encountered by mid-1944, carried 3,400 rounds of ammunition, 425 rounds per gun. At maximum combat rate, that provided roughly 50 seconds of continuous fire. But pilots rarely fired continuously. They squeezed the trigger in bursts, 1 second, 2 seconds, sometimes 3 if the target warranted it. Discipline extended ammunition across multiple engagements. A well-trained pilot could stretch those 3,400 rounds across 15 to 20 separate attacks. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Republic Aviation, the P-47's manufacturer, had designed the aircraft around its armament from the beginning. When the Army Air Corps issued specifications, In 1940, for a high-altitude interceptor, they demanded heavy firepower to counter German bomber formations. Republic's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, responded with a fighter built around not 4, not 6, but 8 wing-mounted, 50 caliber guns, 4 per wing, staggered in bays that began just outboard of the landing gear and extended nearly to the wingtips. The installation was an engineering achievement that German aeronautical engineers studied with reluctant admiration. Each gun was mounted on recoil-dampening cradles, with ammunition fed from boxes positioned behind the guns to maintain the aircraft's center of gravity. Spent casings were ejected through ports in the lower wing surface. The synchronization system ensuring all 8 guns fired in harmony was pneumatically operated, with backup electrical triggers in case of hydraulic failure. The Americans had created not a fighter, but a flying gun platform, noted Oberst Johannes Steinhoff after interrogating captured P-47 pilots in late 1944. The aircraft existed to deliver the weapons system. Everything else was secondary. Steinhoff, Johannes, Luftwaffe Tactical Analysis, Brief 78, November 1944, Captured Documents Collection, National Archives. That observation was accurate. The P-47's massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine producing 2,000 horsepower, later upgraded to 2,300 inches, the P-47M variant was not chosen for speed alone. It was selected because only an engine of that size could accelerate a fighter carrying 8 guns, 3,400 rounds of ammunition, armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a robust airframe to combat effective speeds. The aircraft's wing loading, at 40 pounds per square foot, was heavier than any contemporary fighter except the German FAR W190. But that weight included structural reinforcement to handle the recoil forces generated when all 8 guns fired simultaneously. Engineers calculated that a sustained burst generated approximately 1,200 pounds of rearward force, enough to momentarily slow the aircraft's forward speed by several miles per hour. Pilots felt that recoil as a shudder through the control stick, a rhythmic hammering that matched the gun's firing cycle. It was unlike anything experienced in lighter fighters. "You didn't aim the P-47, recalled Captain Robert Johnson, an ace with 28 confirmed kills. "You pointed it, and when you pressed the trigger, the whole machine shook like a freight train hitting a curve, but everything downrange just ceased to exist." Johnson, Robert. Fighter Pilot's Memoir, 1958, Random House. German pilots, who survived encounters with P-47 seconds, described a phenomenon they termed Feuerwand, wall of fire. It referred to the visual effect of converging tracer streams at ranges between 200 and 400 yards, where the guns' trajectories overlapped. Within that convergence zone, the probability of a hit approached statistical certainty. If an aircraft occupied that space, it would be struck. The only question was how many times. Luftwaffe after-action reports from June through August 1944 recorded an average of 19.7 hits per aircraft downed by P-47 fire, far exceeding the 6 to 8 hits typical of fighters equipped with 4 guns. The excess damage was not merely redundant, it eliminated the possibility of aircraft survival. German maintenance crews examining wrecks found that even aircraft with self-sealing fuel tanks and armoured cockpits had been overwhelmed by sheer volume. Fuel tanks ruptured despite sealant. Armour plating cracked under repeated impacts. Control surfaces were shredded into unrecognisable metal strips. "There was no flying through it," wrote Lieutenant Franz Stigler, a Bf-109 pilot who survived 3 separate engagements with P-47 seconds. "You either avoided the attack entirely, or you died. There was no middle outcome." Letters. Home, 1944. Private collection, Bavarian State Library. The psychological effect of that firepower density extended beyond individual engagements. By late 1944, Luftwaffe pilots reported hesitation when closing on American bomber formations if P-47 escorts were present. The phenomenon was quantified in classified Luftwaffe morale assessments. Pilots took an average of 17 seconds longer to commit to attacks when Thunderbolts were identified, compared to when only P-51 Mustangs or P-38 Lightnings provided escort. 17 seconds was an eternity in air combat. It allowed bombers to adjust formation, gunners to acquire targets, and escorts to reposition. That delay, multiplied across hundreds of interceptions daily, degraded the Luftwaffe's effectiveness more than raw attrition figures suggested. German engineers attempted to counter the P-47's firepower advantage through their own armament upgrades. The 10W-190A8, introduced in early 1944, mounted two 20mm MG-151 cannons and four 13mm MG-131 machine guns, a formidable battery. The Bf-109G6 carried a 30mm Mk-108 cannon firing through the propeller hub, supplemented by two 13mm guns. On paper, the explosive power of a single 30mm shell exceeded anything the .50 caliber could deliver. But paper specifications ignored the realities of air combat. The Mk-108's low muzzle velocity 540 meters per second compared to the .50 caliber's 890 meters per second meant German pilots had to close within 200 meters for reliable hits. At that range, they entered the P-47's kill zone, where 8 guns created a probability field of destruction. "We had superior cannon," admitted Generalleutnant Adolf Galland in post-war interrogations, but they had superior volume, and in combat, volume often mattered more than caliber. The Americans understood something we did not, that overwhelming firepower applied rapidly could eliminate threats before they became dangerous. Galland Adolf. USAAF Interrogation Report, September 1945, Air Force Historical Research Agency. The P-47's guns also benefited from American ammunition production capacity. By 1944, U.S. factories manufactured over 3 billion rounds of .50 caliber ammunition annually, enough to supply not only fighters but also bombers, where each B-17 carried 13. .50 caliber guns, and ground forces, where the M2 served as a vehicle-mounted and anti-aircraft weapon. Standardization meant ammunition quality remained consistent, feed mechanisms were refined continuously, and logistics chains ensured that every P-47 squadron in every theater received ammunition without shortage. Germany, conversely, struggled with ammunition production throughout 1944. Brass shortages forced the use of steel cartridge cases, which increased jamming rates. Propellant quality varied between batches, affecting muzzle velocity and trajectory consistency. By autumn 1944, some Luftwaffe units reported cannon jam rates exceeding 15%, compared to the P-47's M2 jam rate of less than 2%. That reliability differential was not incidental. It was the product of American industrial philosophy mass. Production optimized through iterative refinement. The Browning M2 had been in production since 1933, with over a decade of manufacturing improvements incorporated into wartime variants. By contrast, German cannons like the Mk-108 were introduced rapidly, with insufficient time for troubleshooting before frontline deployment. When Republic Aviation's engineers visited European fighter bases in late 1944 to gather combat feedback, P-47 pilots consistently praised the guns' reliability. Armament chiefs reported that guns could fire their entire ammunition load without malfunction in over 85% of sorties. Maintenance time between gun replacements averaged 150 flight hours, far exceeding initial specifications. "The guns just worked," said Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski, top P-47 ace in Europe with 28 aerial victories. "Every single time. You pulled the trigger, and they fired. You didn't think about it." That confidence, knowing the weapons would function exactly as designed, made you aggressive. And aggression won fights. Gabreski, Francis. Oral History Interview, 1982, Air Force Historical Research Agency. That confidence, multiplied across thousands of pilots, transformed the P-47 from a mere weapons platform into a psychological weapon. German pilots knew that every engagement with a Thunderbolt carried mortal risk, not from superior maneuverability or speed, but from the certainty that if the American pilot achieved firing position, the outcome was predetermined. The P-47 didn't need to outfly its opponent. It only needed 2 seconds of trigger time. On August 19, 1944, Major Heinz Baer, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced aces with over 200 victories, led a formation of 4 190-seconds, intercepting a bomber stream near Stuttgart. The Americans had refined their escort tactics by then. P-47 seconds flew high cover at 28,000 feet, while P-51 seconds escorted closer to the bomber boxes. Baer's plan relied on speed, a diving attack through the high cover, quick firing, passes at the bombers, then a high-speed escape before the Mustangs could react. The plan lasted exactly 90 seconds. As Baer's formation climbed through 24,000 feet, 4 P-47 seconds rolled into their attack dive. The Thunderbolts had been loitering 4,000 feet above, invisible against the sun. They dove at near vertical angles, accelerating past 500 miles per hour. Baer's pilots scattered, but the P-47 seconds didn't pursue individual targets. They fired into the formation's center, where aircraft density was highest. Within 6 seconds, 3/4 190 seconds were falling. Baer watched his wingman's aircraft shudder as if struck by invisible hammers, pieces of cowling and canopy ripping away before the entire fuselage rolled inverted and began tumbling. Another 4 190 simply exploded, a brief orange flash, and then nothing but debris spiraling downward. There was no tactical response, Baer wrote in his mission log, no evasion technique. They achieved firing position, and that was the conclusion. We either avoided them entirely or died. Baer, Heinz. Jagdgeschwader 1, War Diary, August 1944, Bundesarchiv. The incident encapsulated a deeper divergence in combat philosophy. The Luftwaffe had been built around the concept of the Experten, highly trained, tactically brilliant pilots who relied on skill, experience, and superior aircraft handling to achieve victory. German training emphasized dogfighting, angles, energy management, and marksmanship. A German pilot learned to conserve ammunition, firing only when the enemy filled his gun sight. The Americans had industrialized air combat. They built fighters like the P-47 that didn't require dogfighting superiority. They trained pilots in formation discipline, mutual support, and overwhelming firepower application. If a German pilot needed 20 combat sorties to become effective, an American pilot in a P-47 could be dangerous after 5. The aircraft compensated for inexperience with sheer destructive capacity. Luftwaffe training officers recognized this shift, but lacked resources to counter it. By mid-1944, German pilot training had been reduced from 240 hours to as few as 110 hours due to fuel shortages and the need for rapid pilot replacement. New pilots arrived at frontline units with minimal gunnery training and virtually no experience in formation tactics. The Luftwaffe's response was to double down on individual skill development, teaching pilots advanced aerobatic maneuvers and deflection shooting techniques. The Americans took the opposite approach. P-47 training emphasized standardized procedures: maintain formation discipline, use altitude advantage, execute coordinated attacks, and apply maximum firepower. "We didn't train artists," said Colonel Hubert Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group. "We trained mechanics, pilots who could follow procedures, trust their wingmen, and press the trigger when the geometry was right. The airplane did the rest." Zemke, Hubert. Fighter Command Interview, 1977, National Museum of the USAF. That mechanical approach extended to tactics. The P-47's standard attack profile, diving from altitude, firing a burst, then zooming back to altitude using excess speed, required no exceptional flying skill. It was geometry and energy management reduced to a formula. German pilots, trained to fight in the horizontal plane through turning combat, found themselves unable to respond. By the time they recognized the attack, the P-47 was already firing. By the time they maneuvered to counter, the P-47 was climbing back to altitude, untouchable. The 8-gun armament made this tactic devastatingly effective because it eliminated the need for precision. In traditional air combat, a pilot with 4 guns needed to place rounds precisely on target, engine, cockpit, fuel tanks. The P-47 pilot simply needed to put the target somewhere within a 30-degree cone in front of his aircraft and pull the trigger. Statistical probability ensured hits. German gun camera analysis from late 1944 revealed that P-47 pilots achieved hit rates of 12–15% per round, fired seemingly low until multiplied by the number of rounds fired. A 2-second burst that released 107 rounds achieved an average of 13 hits. 50 caliber rounds striking anywhere on a fighter aircraft was catastrophic. Luftwaffe technical reports tried to quantify the phenomenon. One analysis from October 1944 calculated that the P-47's effective kill sphere, the 3-dimensional space within which a burst had a 90% probability of downing an opponent, extended 150 meters forward and occupied roughly 40 degrees of arc. For comparison, an FW-190 with two 20mm cannons had a kill sphere of approximately 80 meters and 20 degrees. The P-47's lethal volume was nearly 4 times larger. They turned air combat into an industrial process, wrote Major Günther Rahl, 3rd highest scoring ace in history with 275 victories. Each engagement was a production line. They entered with altitude, applied firepower, exited with altitude, repeated endlessly. We couldn't compete because we tried to fight as individuals while they fought as a system. Rahl, Günther. Memoirs of a Fighter Pilot, 1952, privately published. Every P-47 squadron in the 8th Air Force received standardized ammunition loads, a mixture of armor-piercing incendiary, API, armor-piercing AP, and tracer rounds in a 3:1 ratio. API rounds used a hardened steel core to penetrate armor, with a small incendiary charge that ignited on impact. AP rounds penetrated without incendiary effects. Tracers provided visible feedback, allowing pilots to correct their aim. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. This ammunition mixture was not arbitrary. It was the result of extensive testing at Wright Field, where ballistics engineers fired thousands of rounds at captured German aircraft to determine optimal penetration and damage characteristics. They found that API rounds were most effective against fighters, while straight AP rounds better penetrated bomber structures. The 3:1 ratio provided flexibility for mixed target engagement. German ammunition, by contrast, varied widely. Some units received mostly high-explosive incendiary, HEI rounds for their 20mm cannons, effective against bombers but less so against fighters. Other units received armor-piercing composite rigid, APCR rounds designed to penetrate heavy armor but lacking explosive filler. Ammunition supply depended on factory output rather than tactical requirements, and shortages meant squadrons often fought with whatever was available. The P-47's logistical advantage was equally profound in maintenance. The M2 Browning's design allowed field-level replacement of worn barrels within 30 minutes. Armament crews carried spare barrels, and pilots routinely flew with guns that had been refurbished between missions. German cannons, particularly the Mk-108, required depot-level maintenance for barrel changes, a process taking days and requiring specialized tools often unavailable at frontline bases. By early 1945, German pilots reported flying missions with one or more cannons inoperative due to maintenance backlogs. One Jagdgeschwader 52 report from February 1945 noted that only 40% of operational aircraft had all weapons functioning. The remaining 60% flew with reduced armament or none at all, relying on the hope that their presence alone would deter attack. It did not. P-47 pilots learned to identify aircraft with inoperative weapons by their hesitant maneuvering and reluctance to engage. Those aircraft became priority targets. The psychological burden on German pilots intensified throughout 1944. Luftwaffe morale reports documented increasing instances of Kanalkrankheit channel sickness, a term originally describing pilot stress over the English Channel, but which came to encompass general combat anxiety. Pilots described feeling hunted, unable to predict when or where P-47 seconds would appear. The Thunderbolt's combat radius with drop tanks, it could escort bombers 475 miles from base, meant German pilots encountered them across nearly all of occupied Europe. There was no safe airspace, no rear area where pilots could relax. Every takeoff carried the possibility of encountering aircraft that could kill them in seconds. We became defensive in our thinking, admitted Oberleutnant Walter Krupinski, who survived the war with 197 victories. Before 1944 we hunted. After 1944 we survived. The P-47 was central to that shift. Not because it was faster, it wasn't. Not because it turned better, it didn't. But because it carried enough guns that a single mistake meant death. And after a year of combat, everyone makes mistakes. Krupinski Walter, USAF Oral History, 1973. American intelligence officers, studying Luftwaffe pilot interrogations, noticed a recurring theme. German pilots expressed frustration not at being outskilled but at being outgunned. The difference was fundamental. Outskilling an opponent implied that greater expertise could reverse outcomes. Outgunned implied structural disadvantage that no amount of individual skill could overcome. That realization demoralized the Luftwaffe more than attrition alone. The Experten system had created an Air Force culture where individual prowess was celebrated. Aces like Erich Hartmann, Gerhard Barkhorn, and Günter Rahl were national heroes. But by late 1944, even aces admitted that against a well-flown P-47, survival depended more on luck than skill. "I flew 800 combat missions," Hartmann said after the war. "In perhaps 50 of those, I faced P-47 seconds. I avoided combat in 40 of them. In the remaining 10, I was lucky." That's not skill. That's probability. Hartmann, Erich. Interview transcript 1969, Bundesarchiv. Republic Aviation's production of P-47 seconds reflected American industrial capacity at its peak. By 1944, 3 factories, Farmingdale, New York, Evansville, Indiana, and a Curtiss Wright plant in Buffalo were producing over 600 P-47 seconds per month. Total production reached 15,683 aircraft by war's end, making it the most produced American fighter of the war. Germany, for comparison, produced approximately 20,000 Bf-109 seconds and 20,000 Fu-190 seconds combined throughout the entire war. An average of roughly 670 fighters per month across all types. But German production was dispersed across dozens of small factories, many operating underground to avoid bombing. Quality control suffered, delivery times stretched, and by 1945, even when aircraft rolled off assembly lines, there was insufficient fuel to fly them and insufficient pilots to man them. The P-47's 8-gun armament, which had seemed like expensive over-engineering when the design was finalized in 1941, proved to be perfectly calibrated for industrial warfare. It was not the minimum firepower necessary to down an opponent. It was the firepower necessary to guarantee results across average pilots, varied conditions, and high-stress combat. That distinction mattered enormously at scale. A force of 100 P-47 seconds, flown by average pilots with moderate training, could achieve greater destructive effect than 100 BF 109 seconds flown by above-average pilots with extensive training. The aircraft's capabilities compressed the skill gap, democratizing lethality. "We didn't need to be Hartmann," said Captain Walker Mahurin, an ace with 20.75 victories. "We just needed to follow procedures and press the trigger when the target was in front of us. The guns did what they were designed to do, every single time." Mahurin, Walker. Fighter Pilots War, 1962, Ballantine Books. That reliability, that certainty of effect, was the true revolution. The P-47 didn't change air combat through speed or maneuverability. It changed air combat by making destruction predictable, industrial, inevitable. On April 10th, 1945, Lieutenant Hans Joachim Marseille Jr., no relation to the famous ace, flew his first combat mission over central Germany. He had 112 hours of flight training, 3 hours in the Feuerwand 190, and 0 hours of combat experience. His squadron commander, a veteran with 68 victories, gave him simple instructions. "Stay in formation. Do not break formation. When we engage, you fire when I fire. If you see a P-47, run." Marseille never saw the P-47 that killed him. At 14,000 feet, escorting a formation of Sturmgruppe 4 190 seconds, attacking B-17 seconds, Marseille's squadron encountered 8 P-47 seconds, diving from 20,000 feet. The Thunderbolts came out of the sun, a classic tactic but executed with mechanical precision. Marseille's squadron leader called for a brake turn, but before the formation could react, the first P-47 opened fire. Marseille's aircraft was struck by 17 rounds in less than 1 second. The gun sight shattered, the instrument panel exploded, the control stick jerked violently from his hand as hydraulic lines ruptured. And then his radio went silent as electrical systems failed. He bailed out at 12,000 feet, watching his Feuerwand 190 spiral downward, shedding pieces of wing and tail. He survived. His squadron lost 4 aircraft in 20 seconds. None of the P-47 seconds were damaged. "I thought I understood what war meant," Marseille told interrogators after his capture. "I thought I understood fear. But watching that P-47 fire, seeing the density of tracers, I realized I had understood nothing. They don't fight aircraft, they destroy them." Prisoner of War, Interrogation Report, 4471, April 1945, National Archives. By spring 1945, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Fuel shortages grounded most aircraft. Pilot losses exceeded replacement rates. But even when German fighters managed to sortie, they faced an Allied fighter force dominated by P-47 seconds and P-51 seconds that had achieved total aerial supremacy. The P-47's 8-gun armament had become so common that Allied pilots regarded it as unremarkable, just the standard configuration for ground attack and air superiority missions. But German pilots never stopped fearing it. Post-war interviews with Luftwaffe veterans revealed a consistent pattern. The P-47 was mentioned more frequently than any other Allied fighter as the most dangerous opponent. Not the fastest, that was the P-51. Not the most maneuverable, that was the Spitfire. But the most lethal in the brief moments when combat occurred. "You could sometimes survive an engagement with a Mustang or a Spitfire," said Major Erich Rudolfer, who survived 1,000 combat missions with 222 victories. "Perhaps they missed. Perhaps you evaded. Perhaps they didn't press the attack. But if a P-47 achieved firing position, there was no perhaps. You were hit. and being hit by a P-47 meant you were dead or bailing out. There was no middle outcome. Oral History Interview, 1981, Smithsonian Institution. The statistical record supported that. Perception. Analysis of Allied gun camera footage from 1944 to 45 showed that P-47 seconds averaged fewer rounds fired per kill than any other American fighter, approximately 260 rounds, compared to 320 for the P-51 and 410 for the P-38. The reason was straightforward: 8 guns meant that even brief firing opportunities resulted in sufficient hits to down opponents. U.S. Army Air Force's operational research analysts studied this phenomenon and concluded that the P-47's armament represented an optimal configuration for maximizing pilot effectiveness across skill levels. A novice pilot in a P-47 could achieve similar kill rates to an experienced pilot in a 4-gun fighter, because the 8-gun battery compensated for poor marksmanship through sheer volume. We essentially democratized lethality, noted one operational analysis report from February 1945. By providing overwhelming firepower, we reduced the importance of individual skill and increased the importance of tactical positioning and formation discipline. This approach proved more scalable than the enemy's reliance on individual expertise. USAAF Operational Research Report 45-22. National Archives. That scalability became critical as the air war intensified. Between January and May 1945, the 8th Air Force flew over 78,000 fighter sorties, many escorting bomber formations into the heart of Germany. P-47 seconds flew approximately 35% of those sorties more than any other fighter type. Their mission profile had evolved. Early in the war, they served primarily as high-altitude escorts. By 1945, they flew ground attack missions, strafing airfields, trains, and vehicles with the same 8-gun armament that had devastated fighters. The transition from air to air to air to ground combat showcased the weapon system's versatility. The 50 caliber M2 could penetrate approximately 0.5 inches of armor at 200 yards, sufficient to destroy locomotives, trucks, and light armored vehicles. Ground targets were far less maneuverable than aircraft, which meant even average pilots could achieve high hit rates. German railway operations, critical for moving troops and supplies, collapsed under sustained P-47 attacks throughout 1945. Post-surrender analysis by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey determined that P-47 seconds destroyed or damaged over 86,000 railway cars and 9,000 locomotives between January and May 1945. The 8-gun armament, firing a mix of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds, could disable a locomotive with a single strafing pass, puncturing boilers and igniting fuel stores. They made our railroads unusable, admitted Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments, during post-war interrogation. Not through bombing alone, but through constant strafing. Every train that moved in daylight was attacked. The P-47 was the weapon that severed our logistical arteries. Speer Interrogation Transcripts, May 1945, National Archives. The psychological effect of those ground attacks extended beyond material damage. German troops learned that any movement during daylight invited annihilation. Soldiers described the sound of a P-47's guns, a deep, rapid hammering, distinct from other aircraft as the Himmlische Hammer, the heavenly hammer. When that sound approached, soldiers dove for cover and prayed. You couldn't fight back, recalled Gefreiter Klaus Meyer, a Wehrmacht infantryman who survived multiple strafing attacks. You could only hide and hope. The bullets came down like hail, tearing through trucks, through trees, through anything. I saw a man struck by a 50 caliber round. There was no body left. Just pieces. Oral History, 1994, German Federal Archives. The M2's effectiveness against ground targets was well documented in US Army testing. At Wright Field, engineers had tested 50 caliber penetration against various materials, 0.875 inches of homogeneous armor at 100 yards, 3 inches of reinforced concrete at 200 yards, and complete penetration of standard vehicle bodies at any practical range. API rounds, with their incendiary component, ignited fuel and ammunition when they penetrated vehicles. P-47 pilots learned to target specific vehicle types for maximum effect. Fuel trucks exploded spectacularly. Ammunition trucks detonated in chains of secondary explosions. Staff cars, identifiable by their antennas, yielded high-value officer casualties. Pilots developed an almost casual efficiency in destruction. You'd see a convoy, maybe 20 trucks, said Lieutenant Colonel Dave Schilling, who commanded the 56th Fighter Group's 62nd Squadron. You'd line up on the lead vehicle, fire a burst, see it explode, then walk your fire down the column. By the time you pulled out, maybe 15 of those trucks were burning. It was like mowing grass, clinical, efficient. Industrial, interview 1973, Air Force Historical Research Agency. That clinical efficiency horrified German ground forces more than strategic bombing. Bombing could be attributed to the fog of war, collateral damage, the impersonal nature of aerial warfare. But strafing was personal. A pilot saw his target, aimed deliberately, and fired. The victims understood they had been individually selected for destruction. Luftwaffe pilots who transitioned to ground attack missions found themselves unable to replicate the P-47's effectiveness. German fighters Bf 109 seconds and FW 190 seconds carried lighter armament, typically 2 or 4 machine guns plus cannons optimized for air combat. Cannons were devastating against aircraft but less effective against dispersed ground targets. Their low rate of fire meant pilots often expended their entire ammunition load, perhaps 60 cannon rounds, with minimal effect. The P-47, with 3,400 rounds available, could strafe multiple targets in a single mission. Pilots learned to conserve ammunition through disciplined burst control, but even profligate pilots rarely exhausted their supply. Armament reports from the 56th Fighter Group showed that pilots returned from ground attack sorties with an average of 30% ammunition remaining over 1,000 rounds. That abundance fostered aggressive tactics. Pilots made multiple passes, refining their aim with each attack until targets were obliterated. German soldiers reported that P-47 seconds would orbit targeted areas, systematically destroying every vehicle, every structure, every piece of equipment before departing. There was no urgency, no apparent concern about anti-aircraft fire or fighter interception, just methodical annihilation. They owned the sky, said Hauptmann Josef Priller, a Luftwaffe ace who witnessed numerous ground attacks. And they knew it. They flew with the confidence of men who believed themselves invincible. And by 1945, they were correct. Post-war interview, 1967, Bundesarchiv. The P-47's vulnerability to ground fire was real. The aircraft was large and flew low during strafing runs, but its ruggedness compensated. The R-2800 engine could sustain damage and continue running. The airframe, built with redundant control systems and armoured protection for the pilot, absorbed punishment that would have downed lighter fighters. Combat reports documented P-47 seconds returning to base with hundreds of bullet holes, damaged control surfaces, and failed systems yet still flyable. German anti-aircraft crews learned that downing a P-47 required concentrated fire. Light flak 20mm and 37mm guns rarely achieved kills unless they struck the engine or pilot directly. Only heavy flak 88mm and larger could reliably destroy P-47 seconds, but such guns were scarce by 1945, prioritized for defending cities and industrial targets rather than forward areas. When the war ended in May 1945, over 5,000 P-47 seconds were operational in Europe alone. They had flown over 545,000 combat sorties, destroyed 7,067 enemy aircraft, 3,752 inches air combat, 3,315 on the ground, and claimed over 132,000 ground targets. The 8-gun armament had fired approximately 135 million rounds of 50 caliber, ammunition enough bullets to circle the Earth's equator if laid end to end. The industrial scale was staggering, yet each individual engagement remained intimate. Each burst of fire, each tracer arc, each aircraft destroyed or vehicle obliterated was the product of a man pressing a trigger, applying mechanical force to release stored energy. The P-47 had industrialized that process, making destruction efficient, predictable, repeatable. In the ruins of Berlin, Allied intelligence officers interrogated Generaloberst Hans-Jürgen Stumpf, commander of Luftflotte Reich, responsible for the defense of Germany. When asked what weapon had most affected the Luftwaffe's ability to resist, he answered without hesitation, the P-47, not because it was the best fighter, though it was formidable, but because there were so many of them, because they flew everywhere, and because when they fired, nothing survived. We learned to fear the sound of those 8 guns more than we feared bombing raids. Bombs fell where they may. The P-47's bullets found what they aimed at. Interrogation Report, June 1945, National Archives. That fear, cultivated over 2 years of combat, was the P-47's true legacy. It was not merely that the aircraft carried 850 caliber machine guns capable of 3,200 rounds per minute. It was that every German pilot, every German soldier, every German officer understood that those guns represented the industrialization of violence, firepower, so overwhelming that individual courage, tactical skill, and fighting spirit became irrelevant. In the mathematics of modern warfare, the P-47 had proven a fundamental theorem, that sufficient firepower applied consistently across sufficient numbers could break any defense, demoralize any army, and win any war. The Japanese officers examining that captured flamethrower on Bougainville had glimpsed that truth. The German officers studying P-47 wreckage across Europe learned it completely. When Hauptmann Werner Hoffman finally returned to base after his June 12th encounter, he wrote a single sentence in his logbook. 8 guns, 1 aircraft. Impossible to survive. He flew 14 more missions before being killed in action on July 3rd. His final combat report, filed the morning of his death, recommended that all German pilots avoid engagement with P-47 seconds unless tactical conditions provided overwhelming advantage. That recommendation was never implemented. By July 1944, there were no tactical conditions that provided advantage against an enemy that had turned firepower itself into an industrial commodity. And that, ultimately, was the lesson. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its 8 M2 Browning machine guns delivering 3,200 rounds per minute, had demonstrated that warfare in the industrial age was not decided by individual valor or tactical brilliance, but by the systematic application of overwhelming violence. The aircraft carried the weight of American industrial capacity on its wings. And, when that weight fell, it crushed everything beneath it.